Welcome, everybody, to August's discussion of the Dance of Music of Time, Reading Group 2025. This month, we'll be talking about the Valley of Bones, which takes us into what some folks refer to as the military trilogy within the overall series of the Dance to the Music of Time, which, of course, follows Nicholas Jenkins and its cast of characters through the 6 years of World War II for the British people. And this one is sort of the well, I'll have a little talk about this. So if you don't mind, I have a couple of slides that I want to share. Um, so interestingly, there are a couple of uh, sort of unique aspects. As somebody who took a degree in mathematics, I shouldn't say sort of unique because it's either unique or not. But a couple of unique aspects about the Valley of Bones. I think it's correct to say it represents the most compressed period of time of the entire series. So it really is uh, less than a year. It's really from the time that Nick goes into the Army until his posting to the divisional headquarters in Belfast and finding that he's going to work for the lovely Major Widmerpool. Much of this time and much of the book is during this period that's been referred to as the Phony War. So this is after the German invasion of Poland. There was a stalemate on the Western Front. There really was virtually no active combat along the Western Front. And so there was a staging of the British Expeditionary Forces, plus, of course, the French, the Belgians. The Dutch considered themselves neutral and didn't expect it. They figured, like World War I, they would simply stay out of the conflict. Um, and in this period, the British Army was very much working on training. So there was, as we see in the book, a lot of exercising, a lot of practicing combat, which is often the most frustrating aspects for somebody in the Army because uh, it's like pretending to do your job, even though it's treated, and as you can see in the book, it's treated just as seriously as um, any other activity.
Heil Hitler! And the new kind of war has been rehearsed right up to Battle Pit.
I wanted to talk about a couple of things just to clarify if you're not somebody who's been in around the Army or you're not familiar with the British Army as opposed to like the American Army. Just a few things. So the ranks, the relative ranks that are mentioned in the book, Nick comes in like virtually all officers do. He comes in at the lowest rank, which is a second lieutenant, which is indicated by one pip, as it's referred to, one rank on the shoulder boards or on the epaulets in the uniform. And just to kind of give you an idea of the relative levels of command associated with their ranks, Nick would have been is a platoon commander at the start of the book as a second lieutenant. In some cases, that's a first lieutenant, but usually it's a second lieutenant's job. So it's an entry level command job for for somebody, especially in the infantry. The next up is, as we see with Captain Gwatkin, he's a company commander, and then up to the next line of command. Now, these are commands, which means the officers are in charge of the men, so they have certain responsibilities and authorities in terms of the military justice system. So they can give orders, as an example. Someone in the staff can write orders, but they have to be signed out by somebody in a command position. Then we have the lieutenant or colonel commanding the battalion. And then a lot of folks are not aware that the rank of brigadier, what we call brigadier general in the U.S. military, is associated with the brigade. And then finally, Major General Lidiment, who appears in the book, is the division commander. And to give you an idea of the relative size of those units, so a platoon is typically 2 to 3 dozen men, a company around 100 to 150, a battalion. Now we're getting up to the size of 800 to 1500. And one of the reasons these units become bigger is as the unit size becomes bigger, there's a lot more support functions around them. So at a company, for example, there might be a little signal section. There might be an ordnance section. There might be some other support section like that. At a battalion, you get even more of those, and you start to get the ancillary or the other functions like artillery and cavalry or mobile units. At the brigade level, with 4,000 staff, it starts to become, a considerably sized unit and has a lot of staff. It has a lot of support functions. And this is, for example, where you get things like the mobile laundry unit. And then finally, division is 15,000. So a division is sort of the largest, the primary operational element. Uh, Operations in the field for the Army are typically at the brigade level, and then the division is the major functional level. Above this, you get to an army or a corps where you have 3 and 4 star generals in charge. And also a few of the ranks in the British Army. Um, Privates have no insignia whatsoever of rank, so they're the lowest of the low. Corporals get 1 brevet, then you can go on the way up, and so the highest one we see here is the company sergeant major, who appears in the novel. And just one last mention at the end when Nick is dispatched to the divisional headquarters in Belfast to work for Widmerpool. Widmerpool is the DAG, or the Deputy Assistant Adjutant General, which, if you look at those responsibilities, this is a classic sweeping up of responsibilities that are not sort of mainstream. So it is sort of very appropriate that Widmerpool, with his industry and his fascination with knowing how everything works, would take a job like DAAG and run it into the ground, to even to the point that he feels like he needs an assistant to do that. And everything's going along fine. There's lots of training going on, but then suddenly in the spring of 1940, we have the German invasion of Denmark and Norway and the relatively disastrous British intervention in Norway. A month later, the British forces invade Belgium, the Netherlands, and soon after that, France. And the Blitzkrieg, it really is significant. Look at those dates. 10 May, they cross the border. Barely 5 weeks later, they're marching into Paris. So that's how quickly the collapse of the French forces happened. And that's why one of the big reasons why the British Expeditionary Force was forced to retreat to the coast. And it's really quite miraculous that the number of troops were evacuated from the beaches in Dunkirk and Zoutkirk that were in those middle of June timeframe. Another interesting aspect of this book that sort of is even though, of course, it's often said this is not an biographical novel, The Valley of the Bones is certainly, or I think arguably, the most autobiographical of all the volumes in the dance. Because if we look at Anthony Powell's career in the Army, uh, early December, he was assigned to the 53rd Welsh Division, which was at that time barracks down in southern Wales. Really, I mean, 12 days later, the division is deployed to Northern Ireland. In February, he was assigned to an officer training course at Aldershot, course which is where he had lived, and both Nick Jenkins had lived as a child. Uh, Around April, Pohl's and Violet Pohl's first son Tristram was born. And then sometime in May, the company that he was attached to was assigned to Gosford Castle, which was a training facility. And then finally, in August, he was assigned to the division headquarters. Now, interestingly, he was assigned as assistant camp commander, which was a position, even though it's an assistant position, camp commander is essentially the base mayor, if you will, the base commandant. So he's responsible for the daily running of the facilities. He's not in the line responsibility of the units that occupy that, but it would have been essentially responsible for the day-to-day aspects of feeding the troops, housing, all of those sorts of things. So it was actually a considerably more significant position of authority than Nick Jenkins. However, when we look at Nick Jenkins, it follows almost identically. So he gets assigned, the division is never mentioned. It's not even mentioned that he's in Wales, except that he mentions he's right by the coast. Then soon after that, the division deploys to Northern Ireland. In February, he goes to Aldershot, where he has the opportunity to see his wife and many of her family members. Sometime in April, it's mentioned that his son is born. And then he goes to Castle Malloch, which is essentially like Gosford Castle. And then finally, he's assigned to the division headquarters in Belfast as the assistant DAAG. I put DAAG, but it should be assistant DAAG. Um, and there are a few examples in the book where where Pohl, this is, I think, a good example of where he manipulates a variety of characters from the real experience into that. And he specifically mentions two that were incorporated into this character of Lieutenant Bithell. The first of them is referred to in Hilary Spurling's biography as a Captain Penn Jones. And I love this description. It has to be savored in all. So if you think Bithell was sort of a mess, listen to this guy. Captain Penn Jones, an elderly ex-territorial like Tony, fat, bald, chinless, gap-toothed, with disgusting personal habits and unfailingly defective judgment. He inspired foreboding from the day they met. And this is from a letter that Pohl wrote to Robin Mount. Long experience of figures of this sort tells me that one of these days he will do something that no one in the battalion dreams of now, even though they think him pretty funny. Shiftless and sloppily dressed, sometimes blind drunk, fond of issuing wild
Okay.
threats and
Are you all
making
right?
advances in his dressing gown to other ranks. At one point, formally under arrest, Penn Jones somehow managed to survive for just over 4 months, which is pretty much the part of the course for Bithell. The other character that he mentioned specifically in his memoir, Volume 3, Faces in Our Time, is Jeffrey Dennis, who was a novelist and occasional journalist who was attending the same training course that he did, that Pohl attended, and is essentially has a fictional counterpart in Valley of Bones. Jeffrey Dennis had published a number of novels. Powell didn't think that much of them. He thought they were sort of like overwritten, but had promise. But the particular use of Dennis, his experience with Dennis, is in that first scene with this Bithell, where they mock up a dummy in his bed. And I'll just read a little bit from the memoir about that. Uh, and so they put this in, and he said, Powell says that they had probably played this trick on Dennis partly because he was an odd fish, and some of them may have erroneously thought that he was homosexual. He says, the manner in which Bithell turns the tables on the raggers might be thought implausible in a novel, but Bithell's behavior and its consequences exactly coincided with Dennis's at that moment in the bedroom. No doubt Dennis, like the rest of us, had drunk a certain amount, but he was in complete command of his wits. He glanced at the recumbent dummy, at once grasping the inferences. Without the least warning, he began to perform a complicated dance around the bed. While he danced, hands raised above his head, he sang. This stately pavane continued for a minute or two, at the end of which Dennis collapsed on the bed, clasping the dummy in a passionate embrace. A consciousness of awful embarrassment descended upon all around. In spite of having myself taken no part in the planning of the affair, I had not been immune to a touch of inner uneasiness while Dennis went through the formal evolutions of his dance. The perpetrators of the frolic were altogether discomfited by their own terms. They crept off silently to bed. I don't think I've ever witnessed a similar hoax carried off by the intended victim with such unexpected eclat. So it's just an interesting insight where we actually do see the autobiographical coming together into the fictional version. The last thing I wanted to mention, and this is partly because the lack of engagement of Jenkins as a character himself, at sometimes I find sort of infuriating. This is out of the novel where Nick mentions the first time he mentions the fact that Isabel has had a child. He says, I would think about how it felt to be a father of the times during the latter part of the Aldershot course when I'd been able to see Isabel and a child. She and the baby, a boy, were doing well, but there had been difficulty in visiting them. And that's practically the last mention of the child, or the boy, and the fact it is a boy in the book. In contrast, it was a more profound event for Powell. So he mentions there that he was uh, um, crossing the parade ground in their barracks in Northern Ireland. So this is not when he was at Aldershot. And two of his fellow officers came running across the barracks ground and shouted, "It's a boy." This was the announcement of Tristram's birth. Leave was granted for such occasions, and I got off right away, which Nick implies that Isabel has the child and he doesn't get any special time off to see her. All had gone well. There was a day or two of a new sort of domestic life. I found that becoming a father had a profound effect upon the manner in which one looked at the world. And I'll stop sharing there. I just think that's a pretty, speaking as a father myself, I would suspect that those of you who are fathers and or mothers would say that having children is a fairly, if not the pivotal experience of one's life, and the lack of traction that it has with Nick is almost to me excessive forbearance. So with that, that's all I wanted to say in terms of presentation. Let's open it up for discussions. Uh, did anybody find the sort of the practical knowledge about the Army a bit of a obstacle in appreciating the book? Feel
I
free to
suppose I
raise your hand.
suppose I suppose I've been immured in it for too long, but and had this discussion about all the army stuff on any number of occasions. But yeah, I've learned quite a lot about the way in some bits of the army work, just from having read this book and had subsequent discussions. And it's quite interesting to go back and look at it again. And I think we'll find that with the next two volumes as well.
Yeah, and I would say this is an example where, as I mentioned in the last book at meeting, I think that this is probably one of the most realistic accounts of what life for the ordinary troops were compared or in contrast to Waugh's Sword of Honor trilogy, because Waugh was always in some sort of special unit with odd characters, and none of that was the kind of routine scut work that goes into the day-to-day business of being, and particularly I mean, the army, the infantry is the core of the army, everybody's army, and so it is where you see army life at its most basic. Yes, Doris.
I'm not interested in the army at all. And yet I was very interested. I thought it was so well written. I especially the portraits of the various people and humorous. And it just kept me turning the pages. I was very surprised. I was not, it wasn't an obstacle at all. He's such a good writer. That's
Yeah. Richard?
There we go. Yeah, two things that struck me. And then first off, there's always a section of his novels where I just laugh out loud. And I alluded to it in the chat, the porridge thing. And it was almost out of Monty Python or MASH, where the general is just going around asking everybody because they didn't get porridge, or do you like porridge? And they're like, and then the one really awful enlisted guy was like, and then he moves on, and that was just laugh out loud funny. And I guess we learned later that this lieutenant general was supposed to be, or major general was supposed to be like a big thing, and it turns out he's not at all. The other thing is, this is, as I recall, this is really the only place where we get any indication at all that there's a Church of England. And then we the Anglican and the Catholic uh, chaplains, and then of course the whole Valley of the Bones with this image of England rising to meet the enemy, and it's and again it's like everything else Nick Jenkins experiences. You feel like he's reporting on it, and he's very guarded in commenting on it, and he's just giving us the blow by blow account. But it is a very striking, and of course it leads to the title of the novel, that what he's describing here is the reinvigoration of a military that's been dormant since the end of World War One, and against this background of terrible things happening, and the intimation that more terrible things are going to happen in the next two books, particularly when is it his brother-in-law who's killed?
Robert's killed. Robert Tolan is killed.
Yeah, Robert's killed. One would suspect, and I have peeked a little bit ahead into the next book, but one suspects that more bad stuff is a coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's have Leslie and then Keith.
Unmuting myself here.
Yeah.
I was struck by this because it's set in this very male setting. There are there are some situations where there are women around, but it tends to be this very kind of monosexual ambience. And I couldn't help thinking that it's has an interesting compare and contrast with a genre that I am interested in, which is women's novels, which are set at this exact same period and have very much a similar feeling to them of we're having to be prepared, but what are we preparing for? We've been told to hurry up and then we have to wait. What's going on? And and there is this a similar sense of they're doing these kind of training exercises of air raid precautions and getting ready for the evacuees and having the evacuees arriving and so on. But what's it all for? There's no actual sense of there is war happening. There is a sense of urgency and we've got to do things, but what's also a
Right.
sense of running around in circles,
Yeah.
of and then suddenly it all gets real.
Right. Yeah. Well,
Yes.
a couple of things. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think I've probably had my say. I mean, I obviously don't want to start talking about all the various kind of, it's obviously tonally different from something like E.M. Delafield's Provincial Lady in Wartime, but in
Right.
other ways, it's not that much different. And
Well,
also
one thing,
people having to work with people they would not necessarily ever encounter, people
absolutely.
who they find uncongenial.
Yeah. Well, and speaking as a retired military guy myself, I mean, that is one of the amazing aspects of service in the military is you really do come into contact from people of all cuts of society. And I would say that an interesting aspect, again, in contrast with Waugh's trilogy, in particular, the fact that Nick joins this Welsh division, where many of the officers, it's mentioned several times, are bankers. They're not public school graduates. They haven't been to university. They haven't been to Paris. This is not at all the upper class that actually Waugh spends most of his time with. The commandos were awash with public school sort of graduates and university graduates and people with peculiar talents, whereas this is very much a mainstream army because that's the nature of the army in a wartime, in a mass warfare situation like World War II and World War I, is suddenly you have a huge influx of civilians who don't come from sort of the elite class of they haven't been to Sandhurst, for example. They haven't been, they're not upper class in that sense. Um, so yeah, let's see. We've got Keith and then John.
I'll pick up quickly on your point there, Brad, about the officers. The lower ranking officers, certainly, yes. I mean, they're small town bank managers and people like that. They're not bankers in the corporate sense that we tend to think of them. They're small town bank managers, bank clerks, people like that. I mean, they're the sort of guys who've been to grammar school and done reasonably well for themselves. And yeah, I mean, the other ranks would have been miners and people like that, labourers, all those sorts of people. I'll pick up on Richard's point about the humour. I love, and this applies to all the novels. I love Powell's throwaway sort of humorous pieces of description, and I mean the one that really got me in Valley of Bones was when they're at training centre, he and Odo Stevens. He says, "We were squadded by a stagey cluster of Glengarry capped staff sergeants left over from the Matabele campaign, with Harry Lauder accents and eyes like poached eggs." And I think that's absolutely brilliant because you can just see it. I mean, and you can see, you know, thinking of a later genre, you can see actors like Windsor Davis playing that sort of role. But it's also interesting to me that, you know, it's this antipathy is the wrong word, but you know, slight disconnect with the Scots, and you can see here that he's probably pulled some of this out from writing Caledonia, you know, five, you know, well, would have been in the sort of early mid 30s, you know, and it's the same sort of feel, and I thought that was no, that got, you know, sort of hit me, and I thought, you know, hang on, this is interesting that you can make that connection as well, right back to, you know, his earlier works.
Right. Right. Interesting comment. Next we have John Blackster. You need to unmute, John.
No, clicked and it moved. This is one of my favourite in the 12 out of the 12 books, and it's interesting that it is so different. I just wonder how the sequence would seem if you didn't, after the first 6, have this clearing a lot of the stuff and starting on something new. And it is interesting that when Powell conceived the idea of, instead of inventing a new cast for each novel, he would have same characters
Sorry, we've got somebody
appearing and disappearing. The first, I think probably the first 2 chapters, none of the old brigade are involved at all. He's got it could be a completely different sequence. And also I like it because I think you do see a very different side of Nick, and he's lost his ability to sort of be very calm and always, to some extent, sail through things. I mean, there's a nice bit where he says, "I felt despair," but also there are some very human things as well. I mean, I was struck actually just by something where he's saying goodbye when he leaves at the end of a book, and he's got quite an emotional thing with his CSM Cadwallader, who's a very significant character, as you know, if you know about the army. You know, that is somebody that the officers really do rely upon.
absolutely.
I mean, I'm very friendly with a CSM who retired to a place where I go fishing, and he says it's extraordinary that 20 years after he left the army, he still has odd officers bumbling in and expecting him to sort out broken down cars or leaky boats or whatever it is. And I find that's very interesting, that he is sort of wrong-footed, and things like when he has to swim the canal. You know, he's as you would be in that situation in the art, you know, where you suddenly find yourself, you're not a regular soldier, you're dumped in there, but you're always wondering what on earth you're going to be asked to do next, and whether or not you'll be able to cope with it, and whether or not the troops, which, as you've said, are a motley crew, whether they're going to let you down.
Yeah. Well, I thought there's a scene right at the end where Gwatkin has, you know, found out he's being relieved of command, which is really a disgraceful thing to have happen as an officer. It really is going to be the end of his career. But there's an exchange between Gwatkin, Kedward, and Nick, where suddenly in about 2 paragraphs, primarily through comments that Kedward makes, you can see that of the 3 of them, he is the most clearly marked man of ability when it comes to commanding army unit, because he's noticing the details. And what's significant about that is that Pohl makes it very clear this period where you're sort of idling around and waiting and practicing and I mean, it's the nature of military forces. You're usually practicing for what to do something that you don't know what it's going to be. I mean, you don't know when it's going to be, you don't know where it's going to be, how it's going to be. Uh, it's extraordinarily difficult from a morale standpoint to maintain focus on the details. And this is where you see, to Nick, it's sort of like this, so my cape isn't run, my gas cape isn't rolled up properly. Big deal. Kedward is paying attention to these little details because that truly is the nature of a combat unit. You're not you spend most combat units spend most of their time not doing combat, and it becomes so important that you focus on the details because when you do go into combat, you have no time for any of that stuff. You have to be able to take it for granted on the part of your troops and yourself as an officer. And so that exchange to me was sort of like Nick's recognition. This is not what I'm cut out for.
And also, of
Let's
course,
have Nicholas Burns and then Paul.
Thank you very much, Brad. I'm on the street, so I'm just ducking out of the noise. But thank you. You gave a very fine presentation on the Army and the war and the background, and I think it's so valuable to our audience that you did that. I have a big point and a small point to make, and one, which is the biggest possible point about the novel, is the you sent around very kindly the Malcolm Muggeridge review, which broke their friendship. And AP and Malcolm Muggeridge had been good friends, and their friendship was irretrievably broken by that review. And I, of course, had read that review before, but I was focused on Muggeridge seeming to call AP a snob. What I now realize, and what you sending it and making me read it again made me realize, is that AP in the War trilogy was, as you say, he was trying to break out of the social milieu that the reader had become habituated to, that milieu of the contact zone between the aristocracy and Bohemia and literary London. And there have been various judgments about whether he succeeded or didn't succeed in doing that. And I talked to various English people who served in World War II, people who served in World War II in the British Army. Most of them felt he did, but a lot of critics still don't buy that AP was capable of talking about this very different social milieu, as you say, of the Welsh bank managers. From Muggeridge's response, though, which was, as AP noted, fueled by envy, I think from Muggeridge's point of view, AP must have brilliantly succeeded. And that AP managed to write about people not like him, which Malcolm Muggeridge could never do. And I think he very much succeeded in the eyes of people who were there. And sometimes a negative review can really shed light in that way, and I think it did. So my sense of AP succeeding in that new kind of social representation has increased. The very minor point I wanted to make, I did mention this in my book, it's a very pedantic and obscurantist point. When Nick Jenkins comes to join the regiment, he recalls at the very beginning his ancestors, including his ancestors who were involved in the British Empire, which was one of the few times the British Empire is mentioned. But he also mentions his most remote ancestor, the ancient British king Cunedda, Q-U-N-E-D-D-A, which I will pronounce Cunedda. Who knows how it was really pronounced? And the point is, Cunedda in the early Middle Ages ruled over both parts of what is now Wales and parts of what is now Scotland. So with the animus towards Scotland, which we see in Caledonia, his poem of the mid-30s, and which I, as somebody of partially Scottish descent, am sensitive to, but I think AP understood that the Welsh and Scots were related and that it was all really a game, that he did not hate Scottish people or have any real animus against them, that it was all a form of game, as satire so often is. And so that's what understanding that historical reference, I think, does. But my general point is, I think more than ever that Anthony Powell brilliantly succeeded in getting out of the social terrain of the first 6 books. And because, as you say, in wartime, it's all hands on deck. In wartime, you meet people you wouldn't meet in peacetime, as your own experience, Brad, indicates. I think AP very much succeeded in that.
Yeah, yeah. I would say also just a sort of a social note that the Scots consistently rose to the command sergeant major ranks in the British Army because very often it was an escape. I mean, proportionally, there were far more Scots in the regular army, the British Army, and particularly that did the dirty work of going out to the colonies. And so the other ranks, the higher ranks of the upper rank, there was a disproportionate number of Scots in that, partly because there was nothing to go home to. Uh, they usually came out of grinding poverty. It was really an escape from an environment, a very depressed environment. And then also because they had this incredible Presbyterian discipline and ability to do the routine work in and out and there were, of course, lots of Scots in, for example, the British Civil Service administering the colonies. So I think, clearly Powell was aware of that and recognized how much of a bedrock of the day in, day out work of the Army they were. Paul Milligan?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I'm married to a Scot, and she certainly keeps me in line, so I can vouch for that. Let me just take a different angle. Towards the end of the book, I remember reading this when I was sitting in my room in Borneo, and at the point where he turned around, it was Widmerpool. I actually had to put the book down at that point, I remember, because it was such a kind of hand grenade thrown in on all sorts of different levels. And when I talked to Alvin Rakoff when he made the TV film, he said the army bits were good but tricky because there were so many different elements, as we've mentioned. A whole new cast of characters appears. So he didn't use he cut Gwatkin out, for example. But he said you'd think that Powell in a previous life had been a film scriptwriter because some of these scenes are actually perfect as kind of film scenes. I mean, that one where he comes into the room and the guy turns around and it's Widmerpool, he said is absolutely brilliant. And with General Lindemann. And he mentioned a detail which he used in the film, which is when Widmerpool turns around, he starts talking to Jenkins in that very self-satisfied, pompous way, my boy, etc., etc. And he took off his spectacles. And Alvin Rakoff said that was brilliant because I could then give a note to the actor to say, if you take your specs off and start to clean them as you're talking, that adds that extra air of, you're down here and I'm up here kind of atmosphere to the whole scene. So so I was able to say to Alvin, well, actually, he was a film script writer in a previous life. He went to Hollywood and wrote film scripts, which he didn't know. And he said, well, that explains a lot. He said, because there are many bits in the novel which come over to me as kind of perfectly geared for the cinema or a film. So the way he does them, the set pieces, etc. So I think this is one of the novels where that element of Powell's background and experience does come through.
Right.
Thank you, Brad.
Of course, it's interesting that the BBC series completely omitted the time with the Welsh division. I mean, it just didn't happen. We first encountered Nick.
Not entirely. No, there was the General Lindemann. He had the interaction with General Lindemann.
Yeah, but that's when he's at the division headquarters in the next book.
Correct. And Alvin said it's just too difficult and too expensive to put all that together, and actually too complicated for the audience because, as John Blackster and others have said, you're into a completely different cast of characters. So when you're trying to keep the viewer to understand what's happening with the thread of what is a very complicated novel in the first place. He said that was just an extra complication that that he wouldn't have worked really to hold the viewer's attention. Difficult enough in 2-hour episodes, in any case.
Any thoughts on why this volume out of all of them is so closely parallels Powell's own experience? Does that stumps everybody?
Well, perhaps because of all his experiences, this is the most specific because he didn't, I assume, I haven't read the two subsequent books. I assume did he see combat?
No.
Yeah, so I think he's like focusing on this because this is I mean, in other words, in the others, his milieu, he knows a lot about art. He knows a tremendous amount about literature. He knew stuff about the movies, so he can kind of go, free range in some of that. But here he's very specific because his experience is very specific to him, and he doesn't necessarily want to branch out further because maybe he just doesn't know how. In other words, he doesn't know combat. He doesn't know this. He doesn't that. So he's just focusing directly on what he knows to get for this because he just doesn't have that experience of a broader military experience.
Right, right. John, then Keith.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I was going to say. But I think his experience was so intense, and for him it was the experience of war. And whereas with his other experiences in publishing, as you said, and film scripts and so on, he could sort of make a melange from all of that, and also bring in various characters and mix them up. I think there he had very powerful ingredients, but they were almost, they couldn't really be diluted or mixed too much because they were pure. I think, and I think also because of his emotions regarding the situation and that he found himself in and so on, that also possibly meant that he wanted to keep them as well as accurate as possible. I'm going to put that on.
Okay. Well, I just want to correct myself on a comment I made. Powell saw the same combat that millions of Britons saw, which is he was bombed. So that's as vivid. I mean, that's a pretty vivid combat experience because, and it's somewhat more frightening because of the uncertainty associated with it. So it's not true. He didn't see army to army conflict in the way that the men in his division would have seen when they went to Normandy. And the Irish or the Welsh division was like much of Montgomery's army. After the Normandy invasion, they took the left flank and went through the Netherlands, which was just brutal combat. Because if you've ever been in the Netherlands, you'll find that there are very few places to hide behind. And you're fighting from dike to dike to dike, from road to road to road. So it was really a terrible campaign. Keith?
Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe take John and Richard's points a little bit further. I mean, I think one reason Powell may have ended up, let's say, I'm not sure he planned it this way, but ended up with such a condensed volume novel, is that time in the army, when he first goes into the army, it's different. It's totally different to anything he's done before. Even the OTC at Eton would have been nothing like. And it was clearly, as you know, and what is he, 34, something like that? He clearly, at that age, it is a big formative experience. It completely changes the way he looks at things. And I think that could well be why he found that he needed to make that relatively short period just a single novel.
Right.
No, and not sort of, let's say, merge The Valley of Bones and Soldier's Art, which he could have done quite easily. I mean, they're not that different. So yeah, I mean, I think it was just so formative because it was so different, and that's not just the army. That's you know, birth of his first son. You know, all of those sort of things going on with his family, you know, his wife's family and so on.
Right.
But, you know, they were happening anyway, but, you know, it all got focused through the army and became such a formative experience.
Well, clearly it was a formative experience for Pohl. One could ask, though, does it seem to be a formative experience for Nick Jenkins?
I think it does. I think it is. And I hadn't thought about this until just now, but you know, thinking I think we may well find as we go on, and I can be proved wrong on this, that Nick's approach is slightly different. You know, he's
A
not
slightly different in what
he's not
particular?
quite the sort of laid back, uninvolved character that he has been up to now. That he's a bit I'm sort of, you know, scraping the inside of my brains here, but I think we may well find that you know, he's a bit sharper.
I mean, we'll see what we get in the coming volumes. I will say that this book contained the point at which I really wanted to smack either Pohl or Nick Jenkins, one of the two, because he makes a passing reference where he says something to the effect of, by this point, I'd written 3 or 4 novels. I'm sorry. I mean, maybe if you wrote 40 novels, you lost track of things, but at that point, an author
Yeah.
knows exactly how many books they wrote. They wouldn't say 3 or 4. And that combined with the, you know, the completely sort of standoffish, I mean, even the fact that he in the few lines that I quoted about the birth of Nick's child, where he doesn't say there were difficulties or with some difficulties. He puts that in quotes because he's essentially quoting Isabel or somebody else. He doesn't even take traction of that aspect. So we'll see.
Brad, sure,
I think that Paul early on took a decision that in order to achieve the approach he wanted with this novel, it was critical that but in many ways not a character as we would think of characters in fiction. John?
Brad, Cheryl's been trying to get in for
Oh,
the last
okay.
few
Sorry, I
minutes.
didn't see a raised hand.
I can follow
Let's do
John.
Cheryl and John.
Okay. Well, I wanted to pick up on something that Paul said about that scene when Widmer Pohl arrives and confronts Jenkins. And at that point, his unbridled ambition is so visible. I mean, it's just everywhere on his face, taking off his glasses. And that brings me back to the comments that you sent, the reviews, one by Brian Moore, who I think is a translator from French. And he
No, he's
about,
a quite prominent
Yes.
Irish novelist, Irish
Yes.
Canadian.
and he said that in Nick's world and the values of Nick, you can never show your ambition. And so that's just one of the ways in which Widmer Pohl is so uncool. The other things that are important in Nick's world are a sureness with women. And we know that Whitmer Poole is terrible with women.
Right.
And a style. You have to have style in the way you dress and the way you comport yourself. And Whitmer Poole is a slob and he has no grace. So
Right,
all of these things just line up one after another of why he is such a loathsome person.
Well, in fact, I think there's a point at which Nick is talking about like going to the pub there in Northern Ireland when they're in Garrison, and he makes a comment about essentially he doesn't have the conversation of women, and you can see because frankly that's probably one of the reasons why the experience of working in serving in for both the author and the character or Nick is so uh, asphyxiating because you don't have the give and take of a variety of viewpoints that you get when when you're having a change between the sexes. You've got people. I mean, as you can see in the conversation of most of the male characters, it would be unbelievably boring to listen to that day in and day out. I mean, that's the thing is in Garrison, you're seeing the same faces when you get up in the morning, at the breakfast table, throughout the day, at lunch, at dinner, in the pub or the club afterwards. It's just so exhausting. The other comment I wanted to make about Widmerpool, and this just occurred to me in the last time I read this, but he reminds me his sort of machinations might remind some folks of Captain Queeg in the Caine Mutiny, where Captain Queeg, one of the brilliant things about that book is that he is so obsessed about the stuff the stuff that doesn't matter. In terms of a Navy officer, Captain Queeg couldn't command a ship out of a wet paper bag because he's so obsessed with the strawberries and whether or not anybody had stolen the strawberries, whereas that's so tangential to the core function. I mean, Widmerpool is just relishing. He essentially has strawberries everywhere he turns. He can make everything into strawberries. So this must have been completely I mean, of course, it's mostly in the next book, but this experience should have been just soul crushing for Nick Jenkins day in and day out, being subjected to this relentless minutia. John?
I was just going to come back when you were come back about your comment on how many books he'd written and whether he could remember. I think to some extent that is perhaps an English sort of diffidence, if you see what I mean. And but if you said, I've written 4 books, that would be rather open to somebody saying, well, to either saying that's not very many or that's too, but by blurring things, and the same with
Yeah.
the continual blurring of, it was not without some small degree of difficulty or, just qualifying things all the time. So nobody could
Oh, yeah.
be too sharp. And a way you also said about not showing naked ambition. Again, if you know exactly what you've done, and or even, I mean, a classic would be saying how much you have managed to negotiate for a salary or something like that. You would sort of play that down. Or in a different culture, you certainly wouldn't. You would make sure that everybody knew exactly how much and what other perks you might have as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Paul?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I remember a conversation I had between there's an Englishman, an American, and me. And the American said to the English guy, "And does your wife work?" And he said, "Well, she plays the fiddle." He said, "Oh, okay." Chatted on. And afterwards, I said to the American, I said, "She's actually on first violin with the London Symphony Orchestra." He said, "What?"
I
Yeah.
So The other thing I
Yeah,
just
I
want
mean,
to, yeah,
I would agree with John's point about I mean, this is one has to accept very early on that Nick is sort of an extreme. He's English diffidence almost at its most extreme as the voice, the authorial, the narratorial voice that we see in this. So yeah, don't admit. I mean, that's you're probably absolutely right. That to say three or four is to show how unimportant it is. N'importe pas, as the French say.
But I've got this
Brad,
friend
could I,
who,
oh, sorry, could I
Go
just
ahead.
make one more point? I have to go in a minute. One more point. The humor. I mean, I think someone in one of the reviews, I think on the back of the Mark Boxer illustrated one said, you know, I laughed out loud many, many times. I mean, the humor in it, the dialogue. Widmerpool, I despair of the general. And that piece of dialogue between him and Jenkins, I mean, it's absolutely brilliant in its humor and observation. And so in what you might think to be a rather sort of unusual place to find humor in these grim surroundings where the guys are sort of training for war. I mean, that comes through time and time again, and his mastery of dialogue is extraordinary, I think, in this novel
Right.
as some of the others. Thanks.
Richard and then John.
but just really quick, I've got this friend who did a lot of business with the English in the city, and he showed me this chart once of how to translate what the English business people were saying, and it's like, well, we might think about that, and the translation is absolutely freaking no.
Yeah.
And it just went all down like
The
that.
French are the same way. I worked in NATO for almost 20 years, and when a Frenchman says it would be interesting if we, it usually means do it. But of course, the French, that's you know, they won't draw direct attention to anything, and it's a slightly different but similar form of diffidence. John?
I think Nick's diffidence can be a little frustrating in the detail, but I think in the overall structure of the novel, it's actually very useful for Powell's purpose in making an emphasis. And when he does come forward, it has extra power. And I was thinking of the passage very late in the novel where he's so pleased to see a familiar face when it turns out to be Widmerpool, and Widmerpool turns around. And it only takes a page and a half because before he remembers why he used to dislike and be irritated by Widmerpool so much. It happens so quickly, and that's quite a forceful expression from Nick after we've had a whole novel of him holding back like the polite guest at the party who just wants to listen to everyone else's story first.
Right.
I'd also like to mention that the passage in the middle, which I've noticed some critics or some some opinions on the novel think that it's a rather kind of crunchy gear change when he goes to the vicarage where Isabel is about to have a baby, and there's a whole host of relatives, and Flavia Wisebite, and there's Robert, and Dickie Umfreville becomes a sudden kind of, we're back in the territory of the old novels for a short
Right.
while. And then clashing with Odo Stevens, who's this kind of completely new kind of character introduced, and has a big impact on Priscilla. I think that's very effective, but it's quite. I thought he took quite a risk in doing that because the tone of the novel in the military tone of the novel is so well established by then that it suddenly reminds you we are part of this big, much bigger novel sequence, and
Absolutely.
it
Yeah. I
suddenly
mean,
no longer stands on its own as a war novel. It becomes part of the overall thing. And I think that was a kind of brave and largely successful interruption.
yeah, I think that's a very good point. To imagine this book in the sequence without chapter 3 where he visits and he sees everybody and so many characters are at least mentioned, so we're doing sort of like a summation sheet of many of the regulars from the previous 6 books. To imagine that chapter not there, it would really stand out as a significant oddity, particularly from the point that you make, which is this is not really about Nicholas Jenkins' transformation. It's really about what Britain was going through at that time And particularly, from now on, this will be the labor government of Attlee and uh, the angry young men coming in their wake. And so there's a fundamental change that's going on, and the Army gives him an insight to what's coming, I think, for the society as a whole. Okay, we've gone past the hour. Great discussion as usual. I love everybody's contributions. A couple of folks mentioned in the chat about Ireland and their neutrality and the sort of ambiguity. I think just a couple of points I would make about that. Remember that Ireland had only been a republic for barely 20 years at the war broke out. It was not a uniform society at all. So there were certainly a lot of folks, and from an economic standpoint, it wasn't in a position to be able to completely isolate itself from Great Britain. So it probably had a fine balancing act. There was certainly a lot more cooperation at the military level than is suggested in this book, nor is necessary. So I don't think we can conclude which way Ireland would have gone if it had been forced to take more extreme measures in terms of involvement with the war. Let's do John.
Yeah, I was going to say that from well, not from exactly personal, but my father was actually attached to a Northern Irish regiment, but it was not exclusively Protestant troops. I mean, he was the medical officer, so he wasn't, he's not Irish himself, but he often jokingly said that there was a lot of tension within when they weren't fighting the Germans and then the Italians, the Italians and then the Germans, that there was quite a lot of difficulties within the within the actual sort of troops themselves on those
Right.
sort of on the grounds. But and also, there's one tiny thing, if I could mention it. At the moment, I'm working on next year's calendar, and this will be using quite a lot of the material from Powell's second scrapbook, which is a lot of it is photographic from his war experiences. Well, his trip to Normandy and so on and so forth. So if people want to watch out for that when it hits the bookshop.
Okay. Thank you, John. Okay, everybody. Next meeting will be on the 1st of September. We'll be talking about the next volume in the military trilogy, The Soldier's Art, which is how Nick endures living under Widmer Poole's scrutiny day in and day out for an exhausting amount of time. And I'll also mention that I sent out a note to everybody about this, but if you're interested in 2026, I will be running a reading group reading Dorothy, a very, very different book, Dorothy Richardson's 13-volume series called Pilgrimage. So if you're interested in that, please sign up for the email list, and we'll be sending out notices as we get closer to that. And with that, let me thank everybody for taking part. Wonderful conversation. I look forward to meeting again in September.